There are people who do not need to appear constantly to be remembered. Just a smile, a gentle movement, a very small moment is enough to bring back an entire era. Dick Van Dyke is one of the very few people like that. At nearly 100 years old, he still dances. Not like an icon trying to prove he still exists. Not like a legend trying to hold on to past glory. But simply, like a person who has never lost his original joy. His steps are still light, his smile still open, and that energy does not feel nostalgic. It feels present. In a world where many great names are tied to tragedy, collapse, or endings that leave people with regret, his story goes in a different direction. There is no scandal that destroyed his image, no fall that made the public turn away, no ending that makes people ask what really happened. He simply continues. But that very continuation makes everything more complex. Because behind that lightness is not a simple life. It is a journey that spans decades, where he has had to constantly adapt as times changed, face periods when he was no longer at the center of the spotlight, and make the right decisions before things slipped out of control. He is not the greatest of his generation, not the most complex, and not the name most often mentioned when people talk about Hollywood legends. But he is one of the very few who has not been left behind by time. And that is what is worth understanding. What has allowed a person to remain alive with energy for nearly a century? How can an artist move with time without being overtaken by it? Dick Van Dyke was born on December 13, 1925, in the small town of West Plains, Missouri, but grew up mainly in Danville, Illinois, a quiet place, far from the spotlight and almost completely disconnected from the entertainment world. His father, Loren Van Dyke, was a salesman. His mother, Hazel Victoria, worked as a secretary. A typical middle-class family, stable, disciplined, and practical. No one in the household was involved in the arts. No one guided him toward the stage. His childhood was not tied to grand dreams. There was no moment of, "I will become a star." Instead, it was a very ordinary life. Going to school, participating in community activities, attending church, and growing up in a period when America was still recovering from the Great Depression. But one thing began to appear very early, a sense of comfort when standing in front of others. In community gatherings, at school, or small local events, he was often noticed not because of a special skill, but because of his energy, a natural flexibility, an ability to make others feel at ease when watching him. Not a trained talent, but a reflex. He did not perform to impress. He performed as a way to connect. There are stories that, as a child, he once considered becoming a minister, a choice that reflected the religious environment and traditional values he grew up with. But even in that thought, what attracted him was not doctrine, but standing in front of a group of people, speaking and creating emotion. That was an early sign, even if he himself did not realize it at the time. When World War II broke out, his youth was interrupted like that of millions of others. He enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces, initially trained as a pilot. But instead of combat, he was assigned to entertainment units for the troops, where he performed, told stories, and brought laughter during tense times. In a very natural way, the path began to appear, not from a plan, not from ambition, but from always being in the right place. When someone was needed to make others smile, After the war, he returned to civilian life without a clear direction. No contract, no agent, no major opportunity waiting. But he carried something more important, the understanding that he could stand in front of an audience and keep them there. And sometimes, that is all that is needed to begin. After the war, Dick Van Dyke did not step into a fully formed industry. He stepped into a world still taking shape. Television in the 1950s, where nothing had clear rules yet, and no one truly knew what would last. There were no major roles, no breakthrough opportunities at the beginning. He started with small programs, short comedy segments, roles that audiences could forget as soon as the show ended. It was not the path of a star, but of someone trying to be seen. In an environment where hundreds of new faces appeared every week, the question was no longer, do you have talent? But, will anyone remember you after the screen goes dark? And that was when he began to realize something important. He was not a classical stage actor, not the type who stands still and expresses inner depth through the eyes. His strength lay in movement, in rhythm, in the way his body responded to space, to situations, to the person in front of him. He began to build his own style, not by trying to resemble others, but by clarifying what made him different. His comedy was not only in the lines, it was in the way he entered a room, the way he lightly stumbled, the way he turned, paused for a beat, then continued. A kind of physical humor, almost instinctive, yet extremely precise. It was not something you could learn quickly, but it was also not something that could be replaced. Gradually, audiences began to recognize him, not because he appeared more often, but because every time he appeared, there was a sense of familiarity, as if they had seen him somewhere before, as if that style belonged to him and no one else could replicate it exactly. But that process was not fast. There was no leap, no moment of overnight success, just a long series of small appearances accumulating into a presence. And from that, a lesson began to form. In an industry full of talent, talent is not the deciding factor. What matters more is recognition. The audience does not need to remember how good you are. They need to remember who you are. By the early 1960s, after nearly a decade of searching for his place, Dick Van Dyke finally stepped into an opportunity he could not create himself, but was ready to seize. When the Dick Van Dyke Show first aired in 1961, it was not seen as an immediate breakout. In fact, the first season had fairly modest ratings, and the show's future was far from certain. But what few people realized at the time was that they were witnessing a quiet shift in how American television told stories. Before that point, sitcoms were often simple and safe. Ideal families, predictable situations, characters who almost never made serious mistakes. But this show moved in a different direction. It divided the main character's world into two distinct spaces. One side was family, with everyday moments, sometimes clumsy, sometimes very real. And the other was work, the behind the scenes of a television program, where creativity, pressure, and personality constantly collided. The character Rob Petrie, played by Dick Van Dyke, was not a perfect model. He could be confident at work, yet awkward in personal life. He could be intelligent, but did not always handle situations smoothly. And those imperfections were exactly what made audiences believe in him. Alongside that, the presence of Mary Tyler Moore as Laura Petrie also played a crucial role. Their relationship was not idealized. It had arguments, misunderstandings, and very ordinary moments, but also genuine connection. An image of marriage closer to reality than any sitcom before it. On the work side, supporting characters such as writers, directors, colleagues created a second world full of energy. Fast, intelligent dialogue, sometimes lightly satirical about the television industry itself, something rare at the time. But the element that truly made the show different lay in how Dick Van Dyke used his body. Comedy did not come only from dialogue, it came from movement. A perfectly timed stumble, a step slightly out of rhythm, a reaction delayed by a fraction of a second. All of it created a unique rhythm, something the audience did not just hear, but feel. It was a combination of technique and instinct, between control and naturalness. As the show moved into later seasons, ratings began to rise significantly. Critics also gradually recognized that this was not just an entertaining sitcom, but a new standard. It won major awards, including Emmys, and became one of the most influential programs in the history of American television. But more importantly, it made one thing clear. Dick Van Dyke was no longer someone trying to find his place. He had found where he belonged. And from that moment on, he was not just seen, he was remembered. When the Dick Van Dyke Show reached its peak, Dick Van Dyke faced a choice that not many could execute successfully, stepping out of television and into film. But he did not choose the safe path. He did not try to become a serious actor by Hollywood standards. He did not shift toward heavy psychological roles to prove depth. Instead, he brought himself, his energy, movement, and flexibility into a genre that demanded more than acting alone. Musical. With Mary Poppins, everything changed. The character Bert was not the center of the story, but every time he appeared, the audience felt a different kind of energy. The rooftop dance sequences, the movements that seemed to defy gravity, and the way he interacted with space, all of it created a feeling that not everyone could deliver. It was not just acting, not just singing, not just dancing, but a fusion of all three within a single body. And more importantly, it did not feel like performance. It felt natural, as if that was simply how he existed. Although the film became iconic for its visuals and music, one detail often overlooked lies in his Cockney accent, often considered imperfect. Yet the paradox is that very imperfection did not diminish the character's appeal, because the audience did not see him as an actor trying to get it right. They saw him as someone living inside that world. After the success of Mary Poppins, he continued with Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, another major project where he once again demonstrated his range, not only as the one leading the story, but as the one who held the rhythm of the entire experience. At that time, very few performers could do the same. Hollywood has always had great actors, always had outstanding singers, always had exceptional dancers. But someone who could combine all three and make it seamless, effortless, that was rare. And that is what defined his place in the industry. He was no longer just a successful television actor. He became an entertainer in the fullest sense of the word. Someone who could step into any space, stage, television, cinema, and still retain his identity. Not by changing himself to fit, but by bringing himself wherever he appeared. And at that peak, Dick Van Dyke was not just recognized, He became part of cultural memory, an image not tied to a specific role, but tied to a feeling, light, alive, and almost beyond time. At the height of his career, when Dick Van Dyke's image was associated with lightness, joy, and seemingly endless energy, something began to appear behind the scenes, quietly, unclear, and completely opposite to what the audience saw. He began to drink more. At first, it was not a problem, just part of the environment. Hollywood, parties, a fast-paced life, and an industry where letting loose had almost become a habit. But over time, it no longer remained within control. Alcohol became a way to balance, not because he was collapsing, but because he was trying to keep everything stable. The pressure did not come from failure, it came from success, from having to maintain the image the audience had grown used to, from always having to appear at the right time, with the right energy, the right emotion, even when inside, it was no longer the same. A smile can be repeated, a movement can be practiced, but a feeling is not always available. And when the gap between the real person and the public image began to widen, alcohol became a way to narrow that gap. At the same time, the entertainment industry was also changing. The 1970s were no longer like the 60s. Audiences changed. Tastes changed. What was once considered fresh began to feel familiar. And for an artist tied to a very specific style, that raised a difficult question. How do you continue when the world around you is no longer the same? He did not disappear, but he was no longer at the center. There was no dramatic collapse for the public to notice, no scandal making headlines, just a phase where everything became more blurred, less clear, and less certain. And that is perhaps the least talked about part of his story, because it does not fit the familiar image. The man who is always cheerful, always flexible, always light. But in reality, he was not that perfect. He had periods of losing control. He made choices that were not right, and he had to face himself when the lights no longer hid the emptiness inside. Not a great tragedy, but a necessary truth, that even those who bring joy to millions sometimes cannot bring it to themselves. After the years when he was no longer at the center of the spotlight, Dick Van Dyke faced a choice that many artists have encountered: to try to return as the person he once was, or to accept that time had changed everything, and he chose a different direction. He did not try to preserve his old image. He did not try to recreate a younger version of himself. He did not try to compete with the new generation. Instead, he changed his position within the story. With Diagnosis, Murder, he was no longer the energetic man moving across every frame. He became a doctor, calm, observant, analytical, a character with more depth, yet still retaining his very characteristic warmth. No longer explosive energy, but presence. What mattered was not the specific role, but the way he approached it. He did not try to prove that he was still the same as before. He allowed the audience to see that he had changed, and that it was normal. In an industry where many try to freeze themselves at their peak, this choice is not easy, because it requires something not everyone has: acceptance. Accepting that the body is no longer the same. Accepting that his role has changed. And most importantly, accepting that his value does not lie in preserving an old image. Instead of trying to stay young forever, he chose to grow older naturally. And that is what created a turning point. He was no longer a star trying to return. He became someone who was still there, in a different way. The audience did not look at him with comparison. They looked at him with respect, because very few in the entertainment industry know when to change. And even fewer can change without losing themselves. And from that moment on, the story of Dick Van Dyke was no longer about fame, but about something else. How to endure beyond one's own peak. At an age when most names of his generation have long left the stage, Dick Van Dyke appears in a way that makes people unsure whether to call it an exception or a redefinition of the rule. He still performs, not in major roles, not in competitive projects, but in small moments, a short dance, a surprise appearance, a viral clip that makes people pause, just to watch. And what makes those moments special is not technique, but feeling. At 90 plus, the body is no longer the same. The rhythm is no longer as fast as before. But one thing remains intact: the joy of movement. Not because he has to, not because he needs to prove anything, but because that is who he is. He does not appear as a legend being commemorated. He appears as someone who is still living. In recent years, he continues to take part in new projects, from television to cameo roles in film, not to return to the center, but to remain part of the flow, not left outside, not confined to the past. And gradually, a different image begins to form in the public eye. No longer just an entertainer of the 1960s, not only an icon of a specific era, but a rare example of aging naturally in an industry that has always feared time. Aging gracefully, a phrase often mentioned, but rarely embodied. Because it is not only about how one looks, but about how a person accepts change, without losing their core. He does not try to hold on to his old version, nor does he try to create a new version to meet expectations. He simply continues to be himself. And perhaps that is the greatest difference. He does not survive time. He lives with it, not resisting, not escaping, not clinging, simply continuing to live truthfully. And in a world that is constantly changing too fast, that becomes the rarest thing. When looking back at Dick Van Dyke's journey, what makes him different does not lie in complexity. He is not the kind of actor who makes audiences analyze layers of psychology. Not someone associated with heavy roles or deep internal transformations. And not a name often mentioned when people talk about great acting in an academic sense. But there is something else, more enduring than all of that. He brings joy, and more importantly, he keeps it across decades, across generations, through the constant changes of the entertainment industry. While many icons become heavier over time, or get pulled into more complex images to maintain attention, he moves in a very different direction. He does not try to become bigger. He does not try to reinvent himself in extreme ways. He simply preserves the core, a light, flexible, bond easily connectable energy. His legacy is not tied to a single role. It stretches out like a continuous flow. From the Dick Van Dyke Show, where he shaped the image of an ordinary yet lively man, to Mary Poppins, where he became part of collective memory, and even in his later appearances, where he still brings a sense of familiarity, even as time has changed everything around it. What is special is that these parts are not separate. They connect into a consistent feeling. When audiences see him, they do not just remember a specific role. They remember the feeling he brings, something very difficult to define, yet very easy to recognize. In Hollywood, a positive image rarely lasts. It is easily broken, easily replaced, or simply no longer fits the time. But with him, it maintains a rare stability. Not because he does not change, but because he does not lose the core while changing. He does not try to become an icon. He simply continues to be himself, and over time, that naturally becomes a legacy. There are actors who are remembered for what they have done, but there are also those who are remembered for how they make others feel. And in the case of Dick Van Dyke, what remains is not only the roles, but a feeling, light, alive, and seemingly timeless. The story of Dick Van Dyke does not begin with a clear dream. There was no grand plan, no predefined path. Just a young man stepping into life with one very simple ability: to make others smile. And over time, that took him further than any expectation. From small stages, to television, to cinema, to a place where his name became part of cultural memory, an entertainment icon. But what makes this story different is not how far he went. It is that he was never trapped at any single point. He was not confined by his first success, not limited by a familiar image, and he did not try to hold on to an older version of himself when time had changed everything. He kept moving, not to chase the times, but to move with them. And perhaps that is the answer to the question that has followed this entire journey. An artist endures, not because they are the greatest, not because they are more perfect than everyone else, but because they understand when to change. And more importantly, they know what to keep when they change. In his case, that was not a specific skill, not a role, not an image, but the original joy. The thing that appeared from the very beginning, when he stood on small stages, without a name, without a position, yet already carried a very clear sense of what he was doing. And no matter how many phases he went through, how many changes, how many times he had to begin again, he never lost that. He did not become a legend in the way many others did. He did not separate himself from reality to become a distant icon. He simply continued to be a human being, moving with time, changing with time, but never allowing time to define him. And perhaps that is exactly why he never became a fixed legend, but something rarer, a human being, still alive in memory. There are stories that end when the lights go out, but there are also stories that never truly end. They simply slow down and continue to exist in another way. Dick Van Dyke is not an actor defined by a single role. He is not an icon built to stand still in memory. He is an entertainer, in the fullest sense of the word. Someone who can step into any space and bring his energy with him. And deeper than that, he is a person who has never stopped moving. Not to chase time, but to move with it. Not to hold on to the past, but to continue living in the present. And perhaps that is what ultimately remains. Not fame, not achievement, but the way a person chooses to exist. If you are drawn to the quiet truth behind legendary names, subscribe to Icons and Legacies, where we explore not just fame, but what remains after it fades.